Welcome, folks, to another podcast on building high performance teams. Today, I am delighted to welcome Barry O'Connell to the session. Barry is just about to take up the role as chairman of Goal, and Barry has had extensive senior experience, CEO of Coca-Cola, over the last, is it 12, 13, 14 years, Barry, across a number of different countries all over the world, really. So, Barry, really delighted that you're here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Dara. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully I can create some value for some of your audience somewhere.
I've no doubt about it, Barry. I'm going to jump straight in and ask if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your career to date, yourself professionally, and anything that you'd like to share about yourself personally as well with the audience today, please.
Okay, great. All right, so I guess important points first. It all began in Cork. I won't tell you when it began in Cork, but it was some time ago. And I spent a very happy 18 years there before I went into university in Limerick. And so I kept it in Munster, and I went in as a business student in there. One of the reasons I was actually very attracted to Limerick was the fact that they were offering this placement program. So you could actually get work experience as you were studying in college.
Yeah.
And the first place I got employment actually was back in Cork in Apple Computers in Hollyhill, which back then, that was around 1987. So even then it was an eye opener to, a young guy going through college, but to see what they were doing was absolutely fascinating. Mm. So got back to university, and then I got a second placement in Saatchi & Saatchi Advertising in Dublin. And whatever I did, I must have done something right, because they offered me a job when I had finished university. So I went back and finished off and came back to advertising for a couple of years. And then I began my Coke journey. Now, in the meantime, I had met Mary in Limerick, my wife, who's for her sins is still with me today. And we've got 4 kids along the way. So when I say kids, you're range from 32 to 27, 22, and we have a 16-year-old going on 28 upstairs. So that was kind of the journey to there. And then I got involved in Coca-Cola in a junior sales management position. I was responsible for service stations and some independent grocers, one of whom you mentioned previously this morning, the Centras of this world. Right. And that was that grounded me fairly quickly, coming from academia and then the lofty world of advertising to selling to the Centra guys in Killorglin. That's a very different experience. So, yeah. But it was brilliant. So got involved in the sales operations there and worked my way through various different sales functions. And then I got the call, which was to set me on a course for the next 20 years or so, which was quite a transformation for me, because my previous boss had subsequently gone to Eastern Europe, where our business was expanding, and he was in Russia, and he called me and he said, look, do you want to come to Russia? The title he told me was marketing director, but in fact it was jack of all trades, because we were setting up our businesses there, and we were literally building manufacturing plants in Siberia throughout the depths of winter. Wow. And negotiating with local wholesalers and recruiting people and doing all of that stuff, right? So, and that was fantastic. It was the best of times. It was also the worst of times in terms of crisis and things like that. But it taught me so much about managing in different cultures and managing in crisis. And it gave me a really, really strong foundation to come back. Yeah. And when I did come back after around 2 years, my then boss said, look, this is going to sound strange because you spent your career in sales and marketing, but we'd like you to be the head of IT.
Wow.
I can still remember saying, look, you sent me to Siberia for 2 years. Now you're coming back and telling me I have to be the head of IT. What have I done? But in effect, what they were doing was very wise. I didn't realize at the time, but what they were doing is saying, look, you need to understand technology and its potential impact on organizations. You need to understand project management and change management, right? And of course, I got that, but I was still terrified going into the role because I knew nothing about IT really.
Yeah.
But I did, and I went in at a time, they didn't tell me at the time they were going to bring in SAP.
Right, okay.
So I was responsible for the initial implementation of that, right? So that was a baptism of fire.
Yeah.
But I kind of got used to baptisms of fire from then on, and Russia started that. And that was a huge learning experience for me. I came off that, went back into the commercial director role in Ireland, which is sales and marketing. And then I got a call to go to Switzerland, where I moved with the family.
Yeah.
At that stage, we had two children. Moved with the family to Switzerland, did that for around 4 or 5 years. Then I went into my first CEO role in Austria. Again, family with me, which is significant because you're taking a really big professional move.
Yeah.
Going into very different cultures and operating environments, and you're moving the family at the same time. So you're really gonna manage change. And then it began to become a passion after that. And then I got a call from Coca-Cola Amatil in New Zealand to say, look, would you come over and help us fix our organization there, which I subsequently did. That turned into Australia for 3 years. And then I decided to come back to Ireland and to settle back because I've had enough of traveling. So I came back, spent a year here, was really enjoying my life, and then got a call to say, look, we'd really like you to come to fix Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei. So I said, okay, fine. And I did that for a couple of years. COVID hit, I came back. And at that stage, myself and Mary said, okay, look, we've had enough of the international travel. Now we're going to settle back in Dublin and make our lives here. And then, as you said at the beginning, I was very fortunate to get the opportunity to chair the goal organization, which I'm really looking forward to now. So that's probably a long-winded response to a very short question, but it's a long-winded career.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic overview. Congratulations on the goal position as well. I know you're starting that in a few weeks. But I mean, when we were talking previously, Barry, you told me a little bit about your experience, and like it's really fascinating to hear how you've been all over the world. You've worked with so many different people from different countries, different cultures. And as you say as well, you have the challenge of bringing your family with you, which is a huge, significant uptaking as well. I think anyone who's watching this will have a family, that'll resonate with them. But I guess, you know, with that level of experience that you have across such a diverse bunch of teams and people, I'd love to understand more about, you know, what leadership means to you, what it means to be a leader in those different types of environments.
Sure. I think the first thing that leadership means to me is responsibility. That you begin to realize very quickly the responsibility you have and the fact that there are so many people dependent on you, and that can be 4 or 5 people. Or it can be thousands of people, depending on the organization that you're, but you impact on the lives and well-being of so many people by virtue of decisions that you take and then you don't take.
Yeah.
And how you treat people throughout your tenure there. You know, when I look back, Dara, what I noticed is that the cultures are very, very different from place to place, but the core values are relatively consistent. So I'll take my most recent example. So when I went to Malaysia, Singapore, Malaysia is made up of, there's probably 65% of the population are Malay. Then you have Chinese, which are 25% of the population. Then you have a large Indian. And then after that, it's Nepalese and so on and so forth. So you've got a massive mix of cultures, right? Wow. And trying to understand each one of those cultures is difficult. You've got to be very sensitive to that. They're very, very different. But when you come to it, the core values of those various different cultures are very similar. And that as a leader is one of the things that I think you have to begin with. If you're going into an operation, as I've done on multiple occasions now, is there's 2 things you've got to get a grip on very quickly. One is you've got to establish the core values of the team and to make sure that they are what you want them to be. And again, they don't vary hugely. I mean, they're trust and respect and honesty and integrity, transparency, those type of things, right? But you have to make sure they're in place, and they're non-negotiable.
Yeah.
The second piece is the capability piece. So if you don't have a capable team or individuals within that team, regardless of their motivation, well, they're not going to make it, or if they can't make it, you've got to identify that quickly and make a decision to either help them, or you've got to replace them. And they're tough decisions, which is why leadership at times can be very lonely.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But once you've got that right, then after that, the technical pieces around setting the strategy, setting the vision, and then implementing the strategy as per the plan, they become relatively easy because the basics are right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then after that, I think as the leader, it's about consistency. Yeah. It's about being very clear in your expectations. It's about over communicating as much as you can, and then it's about making sure that the energy continues to reside across the team.
Yeah. That's one of a few of the things that you're saying there are really fascinating. I think that core values piece across diverse cultures is a really interesting one that, despite having so many differences, when it comes down to the core values, a lot of us are basically the same, no matter where we come from, which is a really fascinating insight.
Well, you see that a lot there when you look at the Chinese culture, Malay culture, Indian culture. Look at how they celebrate. They celebrate with friends and family.
Yeah.
So friends and family, that community is really, really important, right? Yeah. Now, it can differ, and it can also differ by situation. So, for example, if we go back to Russia, Russia was in a critical situation. Russia was a very different culture. And there, because we had to move so fast, and there was a lot of mini crisis because we had a major currency devaluation at the time as well as we were going through this program, then the style that you deployed had to be a bit more directive.
Yeah.
And culturally, that's what was expected as well.
Yeah.
It was more authoritative, right? And therefore you had to lead in that way. I learned a very valuable lesson the wrong way when I went to Switzerland, because I tried the same style and it just did not work. And I had to salvage it again, right? And that meant sitting with the team. And what I discovered was in Switzerland, you have to convince people, you have to convince the head first, and then the heart follows.
Yeah.
And you get 120% commitment, right?
Yeah.
If you go to Italy, it may be the reverse. You convince the heart first and then the head follows. So you've got to be very cognizant of how the cultures differ. But again, the core won't change.
Yeah. I've worked with a number of inside sales teams, probably mainly with inside sales teams and marketing teams during my career. And they have been a melting pot of cultures, people from all over EMEA coming to one place. It's really interesting to hear what you're saying about how the different leadership styles are make a difference depending on who you're talking to and where they're from, because I think that's really relevant. Even if you have a team sitting in Cork or Dublin or anywhere in Ireland or the UK or wherever it might be, if you have all these diverse cultures, like you just need to have that awareness of where they come from and what people are used to be able to manage effectively.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Barry, can I ask you, so you've managed not only large teams and diverse teams all over the world. Can you tell me a little bit about what you see as the key characteristics to deliver performance within those teams? What are those key characteristics that you have to see in those teams? And does it vary? Does it vary from country to country? Would be an interesting one. I don't think I've actually asked that question before, but so kind of what are the key characteristics and do they change?
Yeah, good question. Again, to my earlier point, you've got to start with the core, and once that's in place, you can then begin to manage off that. But the starting point will be very different.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I went to Malaysia, the core values were there. It was a great team. It was a young team, but the capability wasn't. Well, the capability was, but it didn't have the experience, I guess.
Right.
So then but I knew, because I had experience, I guess I knew where the organization needed to go. But to do that on my own would have been a mistake. As a leader, then you've got to lead, and you've got to lead the leadership team to a point where it's their strategy, not yours. Right. And that's particularly important in my instance, because I tended to be coming in every 4 years or so and then move on. So whatever I created had to be sustainable.
Yeah.
So therefore, what we would have done is I would have looked a lot at the process. I would have spent a lot of time up front building the team itself, forget about the strategy, but just building the team dynamics, and then working behind the scenes to create a process whereby we evolve the strategic plan.
Yeah.
But bringing in all of the different members of the team at the right time to do that, so it was their plan at the end. And on the way through all of that, you were building their capability and knowledge and experience. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
And then when we came off that, then it was their plan, and they ran with it. Right. Now they made mistakes along the way. That's fine, but you knew what was going on. So I guess the point is that you've got to kind of stand back as the leader, even though you may know what needs to be done, and look at the bigger picture and look at the team and where they're at in terms of their respective experiences and capabilities. And it's a bit like the conductor in the orchestra, I guess. You then bring them together at the right time to create the result.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Coming off that then, Darragh, I think the other important point is that one of the other core characteristics of high-performing teams is the area of accountability, right? So everybody's got to be very, very clear as to what they're responsible for. Now, the process that we led through that I just described allowed each of, let's say, my direct reports were function heads. They got to see what everybody else was doing as well. So the sales director saw what the marketing director was doing and responsible for. And the finance guy and the manufacturing guy and the HR guy, and they all had a part, and they all understood that. Yeah, they all understood how they were going to be measured, and they all understood their responsibility. There's that word again: their responsibility to each other to deliver the product, right? And then the systems were there, the technology was there to be able to track and record that on a month-by-month basis. Then you get into the rhythm of the team, and then after that, if you have, again, going back to the values. If you have the ability to have that open and honest dialogue, if you've got clear direction, clear accountability, then you see that the team begins to feed off itself and become stronger and stronger and stronger. And what happens over time is, as the leader, you can see it, year 2, year 3, you're saying, these guys don't need me anymore. Yeah. And you kind of know that then that's your job done, and you look for succession. But that's the evolution that needs to happen.
That's excellent. That's excellent. I love the idea of, very clear objectives in the various different roles and responsibilities, so that everyone's working in sync. When you talk about building the team first, is that about kind of instilling those core values around trust, integrity, and transparency, or is it something else that happens before you kind of overlay the strategy itself?
In that particular instance, and I would probably do it again, I would do it first before the strategy, because that's the foundation. If that's not right, then you're wasting your time. And sometimes you don't have the luxury of doing that. Sometimes in a crisis situation, so you just gotta work with what you have, right? But initially, if I had the luxury, I would be looking at my team at least and saying, well, look, what are the core values? And it can be difficult because you don't necessarily have examples to show that. And then you also get an idea of capability, and whether it's a motivation thing or whether it's actually a capability gap, right? What it would have looked like, Darragh, is we would have had sessions before the strategy session, well before. And we would have been talking about, well, what values do we want? And we had a discussion on it. It don't change very much, but the fact you have the discussion just surfaces then. And then we would have, I would have been sharing with them my development plan, where I'm strong, where I'm weak. They do the same. So you get that kind of personal sharing, which is always uncomfortable. But it's also, again, it begins to establish the relationship at a level of intimacy, which perhaps wasn't there before. You move from kind of functional colleagues to something which is stronger than that, which is what brings the team together. And from that, then you can do the other stuff, which is just technical.
Yeah, well, I think that's really cool, actually sharing back with them, even though you're the leader, and you know, people are looking up to you to be able to have that, beg your pardon, vulnerability, if you like, to be able to say, look, guys, this is where I'm developing. You know, I'm on a learning path as well. It must be really inspirational for people, I guess.
Well, I think it's unexpected usually. And particularly, again, let me overlay the cultural piece again. In Singapore, Malaysia, they're quite hierarchical.
Yeah.
So when you come in and you say, look, here's some of the things I want to share. Here's what I'm very good at.
Yeah.
And here's what I really need some help at. People have that reaction of, whoa, hang on. But you're setting the tone then, right?
Yeah.
Because if it's okay for you to do it, then it's okay for them to do it. And the whole thing begins to open up. The other thing I think which is important, Dara, is that there's a question of your style as well. So the other thing I tend to do is talk to them about the style of leadership that I have. So I would be very visual. I would be very creative. I have 100 ideas a minute type of thing, which can frustrate the life out of everybody. If you've got a hierarchical organization and you come with that, then everybody's going to run off and do exactly what you had an idea about because Barry mentioned this. And it's gonna screw up everything. So you've got to be very careful to say, look, I operate like this. I ask lots of questions, but this is the motivation behind it. You need to know when to say, look, enough is enough. Let's prioritize these, et cetera, et cetera. So knowing each other's styles is also very important. Some people will be very quiet in the group, which you will know they're analyzing everything, etc. Right? But they make fantastic contributions. But you have to solicit their input at meetings because you know their style. Others will hog too much of the airtime, like I'm probably doing at the moment. So all of those, but they're all kind of the basic building blocks of getting the team in shape to be able to effectively lead itself.
That's actually. Can I ask you one other question on the leaders? Just as you're mentioning leadership styles, there, for you, where do you sit in terms of leadership and nature versus nurture? Is it kind of something you're born with? It's kind of a natural ability, or is it something that you learn over time?
Again, I don't want to avoid the question, but I think it's both.
Yeah.
I think it's both. I think, look, you get people who are natural leaders and that they step up and they take the responsibility. But I also think you have to, particularly now, because the range of skills that you need, hard skills and soft skills, a range of skills that you need, the awareness you need is on what's happening around, and the awareness you need of yourself. It's so, let's say, sophisticated that I don't think anybody's born into that. You have to have an ability to learn that and to be adaptable as never before. Yeah. So I think it's a journey, and it's constantly changing, constantly challenging, and therefore I think you need to work on it. Yeah, that makes total sense. Can I ask you one other question about kind of the kind of building the team, building those kind of key characteristics, or when you're building a team from either from scratch or whether you're going in to kind of reignite a team, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you've come across? Say, so when you're building that team for high performance, what are the kind of, is there, I beg your pardon, Barry, is there like a top 1 or 2 or 3 things that you see consistently that are particularly challenging? I think what can be very challenging is where you're in an organization where you have either a motivational issue or a capability issue. Right. So when you inherit a team, because I tend to inherit teams, and you have people who are over promoted into the roles that they have. And those people, by the way, might be extremely motivated and determined, great people. They have all of that right, but they just can't get to where they need to get to. That's a very, very difficult, it's probably the most difficult thing that any leader has to deal with. That's one. Then I think the other thing is where the culture of the organization and where there's rot exists within the organization. So where you've got fundamental issues with some of the values that I spoke about earlier, and where it's been ingrained.
Right.
So again, I'm slow about giving you specific examples here, but there's been instances in some of the markets that I've worked on where you have collusion of various different nature, which is throughout the organization.
Right.
And to break that as a new person coming in, that can be, again, a very difficult thing to do, to unroot, right? Which is why, again, you need to galvanize the whole organization behind what you're doing, and then you move on it at the right time and place.
Right. Okay. That's a very cool insight. I've never thought of it like that before, but that makes absolute sense. You're kind of getting buy-in in terms of your, where what the key objectives are, what those key results are that you need to hit, ensuring that everyone's behind that and they understand their own responsibilities within the organization. Then when you have that, you can go in and make those, what can be very challenging changes to make in order to achieve success.
But the change, even, Darren, has to occur at a deeper level. So it's relatively easy to go in and to explain the strategy and the key indicators and how it's going to work and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But who was it who said culture eats strategy for breakfast? It was absolutely right. Okay, yeah. Because you can have a brilliant strategy, but if the organization doesn't believe in it, it's worth nothing. You can tear it up because you're just wasting your time. You're going to frustrate yourself. On the other hand, if you've got an organization which is behind you, and understand what you're trying to do in direction, because nobody will understand the full detail of it, then you can achieve fantastic things with even a lukewarm strategy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is why when you go into the organization, you spend a lot of time, not just with your team, because what you're doing with your team is hoping that they're going to influence their teams, but you've got to do it at an organizational level as well, and be absolutely consistent with your communication and look for ways to demonstrate in practice what you actually mean. Right. So, for example, anywhere I've gone, I would have spent time at least once, if not 2 days every month. I will go into the business and I will spend a full day merchandising coolers with the sales rep, or I will be in the laboratory, or I will be on the production line, or in the warehouse, etc. Right?
Right.
Because by doing that, you are showing people, again, coming back to the humility piece, and understanding piece. If you spend a whole day merchandising a cooler with a sales rep, how long do you think that takes to spread throughout the entire organization? That these guys care enough to come down and to listen and to actually get their hands dirty physically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it spreads like that, and you that again is where you start changing the culture of the organization. And then that's where if you've got more ingrained, more serious issues, you can appeal to the rest of the organization. They'll root it out themselves because they know now that things are different.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes so much sense. And I guess aside even from people seeing that you care and you're want to go down and experience exactly how they're experiencing the work, so you can see it from their perspective. Having that perspective as well must be so powerful in terms of your understanding of the organization.
It's a brilliant point, and absolutely, that's why Russia was so valuable for me, because Ireland, which I left from, was a very sophisticated market relative to what Russia was. Because in Russia, you were doing all the basics again from scratch. But you learned about the business, and you learned that, look, if you don't get this stuff right, you don't have a business.
Yeah.
Right. And therefore, when I spent time with the sales reps and merchandisers, that led actually to the development of an IT platform, a sales automation platform for sales reps, which is now the most sophisticated and is being used right across the Coca-Cola system. Wow. Because you're able to see on a day-to-day basis the people who really implement your strategy, what they were coming up against and what potential they could have enabled by new technologies.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where those ideas, which can transform organizations, that's where they come from, at the coalface, not from board meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes total sense. Do you think that, remote working has impacted on how you're kind of building teams today? Do you think there's a requirement to change leadership styles, or are there Are there new ways we need to look at to help really get teams going? I know you mentioned digital there. That's one of the things that has come up in a couple of sessions. But what's been your experience with remote work and leadership?
Well, I think the important point is that when we're talking about remote working and we use the last year and a half as context, that it's probably the wrong context, because we went from one extreme to the next. We tested, if you like, remote working at its extreme, where everybody went from office overnight, literally, to remote.
Yeah.
And it was also during a crisis. So not only were we remote working, but we were having to deal with a crisis at the same time. I don't think that's going to be the future. People weren't ready for it. We were remote working, and people had kids running around in the background, and we didn't have the equipment for it, etc. So to assess it in the context of the last 15 months is wrong. I think some really valuable insights emerged, however, from that. And probably one of the biggest ones for organizations was under the heading of trust. Because I think one of the reasons we didn't go for more remote working in the past was because organizations, they were trying to write the policy for 10 years, but they couldn't get it to a point where they could absolutely tie it down for the 1% of people who might break the policy. And all of a sudden they found themselves in situations where not only were people working as hard as ever, they were working harder, and they had to bring in policies to say, we're not going to have meetings at lunchtime. We want you to finish at this time. We want you to look at the ergonomics of your office, and so on and so forth, right? So we know that we can trust our people, and that we can still produce fantastic work and manage through crisis via remote working. Now, the question then is, how do you get that balance right? Right? And that's, I think there's no one answer to that. Each organization has got to go through that. Each function within each organization has got to answer that for themselves. But we've shown that it can work. The other thing, by the way, that it's shown is, because again, we've perhaps been in a crisis, is it's increased people's appreciation for human contact and the value of teams when they get together. So it's a bit like I haven't been in a restaurant. I haven't been in my local restaurant for a year. But when I walk back into it, I'm going to notice things I never noticed before, because I'm just so delighted to be back. So, I mean, I think that's going to be very exciting. And we use time to do some incredible things around things like learning and development. Where we just completely remodeled our sales modules, for example, to remote learning. And because we were focusing on them so well, we moved them from, let's say, 5 on the scale to 8 out of 10 on the scale. Are really, really good now, and they can be accessed whenever anybody wants to, and they're really, really good. So there's a lot of good that's come out of it. Now it's a question of settling down, getting the balance. I hope we don't go back the way it was. I don't think we will.
That's, I've spoken to so many people who are, not CEOs, not leaders with your experience, who have said to me, I hope we don't go back to the way we are, because, the way we're working today, having this kind of hybrid approach would really would work for me. So hearing that from someone like yourself is, I think it's great to hear that it's not just, how do I put it? It's not just, your kind of everyday worker on site. It's like right up to the most senior levels in the organization. People are thinking, we've learned a lot here. We can do better going forward. Let's not go back to the old way.
Yeah, and they can if you ask them for examples of that, they can point to them very specifically. Like even in my position, I was reaching out to the organization every month. With a webcast. So there was 1,300 people on the webcast, and I can communicate with them exactly what's going on in terms of how we're managing the pandemic, what the results are for our own staff, how we're looking after people, the extra, and here's what's happening in the business. And by the way, introduce a bit of fun, and because people needed that too. But you can do that now at a flip of a switch. People can access their learning and development modules at a flip of a switch. So it's great. But again, it's a question of, how do you get that balance right? Because we're at an extreme now. How will it settle back? to a new norm.
Yeah. You've mentioned a couple of interesting technologies, like sounds like webcasts have been really useful for you, that kind of online learning really useful. Have there been other key technologies that have been your kind of go-to, during the last year, I suppose, for starters, but even key technologies that have enabled you to help you run your business and to engage with workers?
Yeah, I mean, the technology space in our business has exploded, I would say, over the last 1.5 years or so. And we've introduced new technologies. So let me give you an example. I'll try and put this in the context of Teams too, which is the point I want to make, I guess, because it's the focus of this. But we had, if you go back to the sales guy again and the merchandiser, we introduced technology so that every sales rep, when they visited an outlet, could take a photograph. And within 20 seconds, they had our percentage of space by individual brands on that shelf. Excellent. Right? Yeah. Right, relative to the competition. And we had that for 75,000 outlets every single day. So buckets of data, right? So it showed us how the sales team are performing. But then you had a marketing team who historically were looking at marketing indicators. So they were looking at, share of voice or GRPs and brand health and all the rest of it. Yeah. But very much oblivious to a really, really important driver of performance of their brands, which is, well, what was actually happening on shelf.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, and the point is that we now had two bits of data, but they weren't talking to each other. So we put them together. Yeah. And then we took other data, such as our manufacturing data, because we also knew how much it cost to produce each one of these SKUs. And then we brought the finance guys in and they produced a P&L and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. Now, by combining the data we already had in an organization, we're fundamentally changing how we look at the business. Yeah. And if you take the team, you now have cross-functional teams. You don't have silos. The sales guy looking at sales manager. You have a team looking at the entire circle. Yeah. Right. And that makes the understanding of the organization far more potent. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But also for individuals, it opens up opportunities because the marketing guy says, gee, I'd love to do sales, or there's no reason I can't be in manufacturing because I understand exactly how that works. So their dynamic changes completely as well. Right. So that's transformational. By using existing data, but getting it to speak to itself. Yeah. From a leadership perspective, however, you got to make sure that people can interpret that. Right. So the sales guy may not know how P&L works. So you've got to spend time and invest in that. But you also have to make sure that the team dynamics work. Yeah. Right. Which introduces a whole raft of new competencies. So yes, a long answer or a short answer to your question is yes. It's been transformative. It continues to be transformative. And it's not just the technology. It's everything around the technology that will make it work. Yeah. It's not the technology only. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's having the great technology is only really effective when everyone's using it correctly and everyone understands how to use it correctly. At the same time, it's really interesting. I was speaking with a buddy of mine who was talking to me about how his organization are helping other organizations manage their data and the massive impact it has on productivity, on innovation, coming up with new ideas and ways to do things and finding new lines of product. I mean, it's really fascinating stuff.
Well, we actually, in that respect, what we did was we set up a data insights team, and their job over time is to start asking the right questions. Right? What if we could predict out of stocks in every cooler in every outlet? Would that make a difference to your business? It would make a massive difference. Well, what do we need in terms of data sets? Yeah. What do we have, what we don't have? So what's happening now is rather than coexisting within your own function, which is what was historically, people are given the licenses to dream and to say, well, what if you could predict, right? We wouldn't have done that before, right? And that's a different discipline, both from the point of view of mindset, but also in terms of competency, because then you need different skills to be able to do that type of work, either internally or externally. But it's a different way of looking at the business.
Yeah. Barry, the last question I have for you, and this is one of my favorite questions. I don't know, I probably should say that, but it is one of my favorite questions, especially to ask, leaders. I guess when I look at any of the leaders I've worked with in my past, and even in leading teams myself, one of the areas that it fascinates me when I meet senior leaders who are, they can perform at such a high level all the time. I guess you don't see them all the time, but you know, the performance in such a, like when you're leading large organizations, and as you were saying at the start of the podcast there, you know, you're responsible for these people. So you have to be performing at your best. So what do you do? What kind of tips and tricks do you have? Or how do you work to help you perform at your best, to bring kind of, you know, the best version of Barry to the table every day?
There may be a lot of cliches in this answer, but I think they're true. One, I love what I do, right?
Okay.
And the reason I love what I do, it's not just because you're achieving the targets and all the rest of it. That tends to, I think, maybe it's with age, but it tends to recede in terms of what's important. It's because I love working with the people I'm working with. Yeah. So if I go back to Malaysia, Singapore again, that team, as I said previously, they were relatively inexperienced, but they were a great bunch. And you could see them really developing quickly. That is a source of energy, which really keeps you going, right? But it's not always roses in the garden, because in this role, you're always going to get hit when you least expect it, right? Yeah. And you're going to end up working hard, long hours under stress from time to time. But you know that. I think what's important at that stage is you get perspective. You can stand outside yourself, even when times are good, actually. You can stand outside yourself and kind of look back and say, look, how is the balance working here, right? Because it's going to become unbalanced, and it has to be at some times. But ultimately, it's health and relationships with family and friends. That's what makes you wealthy. That's what it's all about at the end of the day. There will be times when they go out of kilter because they have to. That's just life. But making sure that they don't, and you get that balance as you go through, so you remember who you are and what's really important ultimately. That, I think, is the secret of success. It's like your swim first thing this morning there, or when you posted during the week where you really didn't want to get up and do it, but you did it anyway, and you felt great as a result of it. You've got to work as hard on that piece as you do on the job, because the job is only a job.
Yeah. That's another great insight. And I guess from your own perspective, your experience in having to kind of uproot the family from one country, move to another country, that must have been, you know, something that you had to work so hard at, probably harder than other people who aren't having that kind of moving around like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because moving back has probably been the most difficult.
Go away.
Because,
really?
Well, before you move into a situation and you're straight into fixing what you need to fix. So I'm absorbed immediately in the role that I have. So I'm distracted. When I've moved back, we've now kind of come back to settle in Dublin, which I love, but it's very different. I'm not in the firing line as much. Maybe that'll change over the next couple of months. But I'm not in it as much. So it's great. But again, it's a different context now. It's a different balance.
Yeah, excellent.
I have to take up swimming.
You'd love it. There's some fabulous places in Dublin. I'm from Cork. Well, we're both from Cork originally, so we're bound to say something like Cork has better swimming places. But I'll alienate so many of the audience if I say something like that.
And we all know there's a lot of sharks in Cork anyway.
There you go. Barry, listen, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking with you today. This
Pleasure.
Really superb context and content in there. So thank you so much.
A pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity to do it, and all the very best, Dara.